Welcome to today's video. The story we are about to explore is not just a shocking crime, but also a tragedy of control and domestic violence. Join us as we dive into the life of Kendi Howard, a woman who almost escaped a controlling marriage, but tragically, never had the chance. This is a story not just about a crime, but about the fight for justice and truth. Before we begin, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on any thrilling stories and useful information from us. By subscribing, you'll gain access to exclusive perks and be the first to receive updates on our latest videos. Thank you for your support, and now let's uncover the story of Kendi Howard. First segment, new script. I was sitting in my car late at night. The phone rang with a panicked voice on the other end. "Oh my God, she just shot herself. Oh my God." As soon as I pulled into the driveway, the front door flew open. A man came out, screaming in fear, tears streaming down his face, yelling, "Oh my God, what is happening?" Everything was in chaos. Inside the house, a gunshot had just gone off. "Where's Kendi?" I asked, feeling the unease grow within me. "Upstairs. In the bathroom," the man stammered, his voice trembling. When we got upstairs, we found Kendi lying in a bathtub full of water, the gun glittering under the murky water. The scene in front of me was bizarre, filled with contradictions. Shattered glass was scattered all around, her clothes were strewn across the bed, and wet towels lay haphazardly behind the door. Something wasn't right, but no one dared to say it aloud. It didn't match the scene of a typical suicide. Dan, Kendi's husband, was a seasoned Idaho state trooper. Dan wasn't like ordinary people. He knew how to hide the truth, even how to turn a murder into the perfect suicide, and that might be exactly what he did. But there was one thing Dan didn't foresee. No matter how smart he was, in the end, he couldn't outsmart everyone. "I don't know what to do," Dan lamented, but his eyes remained cold and detached. No one arrested him immediately, and that made me worry. Could Dan really get away with this? The investigation began. The front yard filled with flashing police lights. Outside the house, reporters and curious onlookers began to gather, staring into what was once the happy home of Dan and Kendi. Officer Miranda Thomas, one of the first responders to the scene, recalled the moment she came face to face with Dan Howard. It was a freezing winter morning in February 2021. He kept screaming and crying, but there were no tears. Even when he pretended to gag, nothing actually happened, Miranda recounted. Dan claimed he had found Kendi in the bathtub, her gun submerged in the water. The scene immediately raised suspicions. Little inconsistencies started adding up. Why was there a packed duffel bag sitting by the door? Why was the dryer running in the middle of the night, full of freshly cleaned towels? The police began to grow suspicious. Why had Dan, after discovering his wife dead, showered, changed into fresh clothes, and even applied deodorant? Even stranger, Dan seemed incredibly nervous when they mentioned testing his hands for gunshot residue, something a seasoned trooper like him would fully understand. Kendi's death was becoming more and more mysterious, and the secrets behind this case would soon come to light. Dan began moving his hands, twisting them back and forth as if trying to wipe something off. Those movements only deepened our suspicions. What is he trying to hide? The thought lingered in my mind. Finally, we asked him to stop and take his hands out of his pockets. But what about the test results? Negative. There was no trace of gunpowder on Dan's hands, which only made things more confusing. Despite all the little clues that didn't fit with the idea of a suicide, we couldn't completely rule out the possibility that Kendi had taken her own life. However, her sudden death shocked everyone who knew and loved her. Kendi loved life, always smiling, enjoying every moment. No one believed she would choose to leave the world this way. Michelle Lampert, one of Kendi's closest friends, recalled, "She was the most fun person I'd ever met, without a care in the world. We had such great times together, and she always brought so much laughter." During their adventures, Kendi was always the heart of the fun. One memory that stuck with Michelle was Kendi kneeboarding with her in northern Idaho, a perfect example of Kendi's zest for life. Brooke Wilkins, Kendi's daughter from a previous relationship, fondly remembered her mother. "She was truly special. Mom had such a big personality. She could talk to anyone, make friends with everyone, and joke around like nobody else." Brooke's voice trembled, as she recalled how her mother always spread joy and laughter to everyone around her. Kendi was a simple girl who grew up in a small town in northern Idaho. She loved the outdoors and sports. Her brother Brian reminisced. She rode her horse a lot, took care of sheep, and even had a little goat. She really embraced life in the countryside. At just 22 years old, Kendi married Dan Howard, a former Marine turned Idaho State Trooper. He was 6 years older than her. She told me she thought Dan was very handsome and that he made her feel secure. Brian shared about his conversations with his sister. That sense of security and Dan's strength were what attracted Kendi from the very beginning. The couple built their home on a 10-acre property in the small town of Athol, just a speck on the map, 21 miles north of Coeur d'Alene. Together, they lived a quiet, peaceful life with their son Wyatt, who later followed in his father's footsteps and became a Marine. Their neighbor, Carrie Maitland, recalled, "Their marriage seemed so strong. They were always affectionate toward each other. But beneath the surface of that happy facade, something was amiss, something no one could see until it was too late." Kendi and Dan seemed like the perfect couple. They were always caring toward each other and treated each other with respect. Kendi worked at a local medical center, and Dan was a former state trooper. During their 26 years of marriage, they had built up a substantial fortune, mostly from real estate investments during the state's rapid growth. By the time Kendi passed away, the couple had accumulated over $2 million in assets. However, money had always been a source of tension between them. Kendi felt that her money was their money, but Dan's money was only his. Dan was known for being tight-fisted, which only deepened the conflicts in their marriage. Things got worse after Dan, while on duty, shot and killed a woman during a traffic stop. Although he was cleared of any wrongdoing, the incident left a deep mark on Kendi. She became depressed, and their relationship took a significant downturn. Years later, Dan left the state police, and things between them began to unravel. Brian, Kendi's brother, helped Dan find work on the oil fields in Alaska, where Dan worked 3 weeks straight and then had 3 weeks off. The time Dan spent away from home became an opportunity for Kendi to truly live her life. Brian recalled how during those 3 weeks of freedom, Kendi began to embrace life in a way she never had before. The arguments between them grew more frequent. They were bickering almost constantly. "Every time I visited, there was tension in the air. But I didn't think it was that serious," Brian said. However, Brooke, Kendi's daughter, knew this was the beginning of the end. Kendi felt frustrated and lonely. She was very vocal that she no longer loved him, that there was no love left in the marriage, Brooke shared. Michelle, Kendi's close friend, revealed that Kendi had an affair and even planned to get plastic surgery. Kendi was filled with excitement, as though she had found a new sense of freedom. And then, she decided to tell Dan everything. Kendi told Dan she wanted a divorce and had already started the process of buying a new house. She believed things would be okay, that her new life was just around the corner. By the end of January 2021, just days before her death, Kendi met with a divorce lawyer. When Dan came home from work, Kendi didn't hold anything back. She told him everything. She said he seemed calm, but I could tell he wasn't okay, Michelle recalled. He acted like he was fine, but I knew he wasn't. I never understood it. From the very beginning, none of it made sense to me. When first responders examined Kendi Howard's body in the bathtub, she had a gunshot wound to the back of her mouth and the pistol was submerged in the water. Dan Howard told everyone that Kendi had taken her own life. But did I believe that? Absolutely not. I couldn't imagine Kendi leaving behind her kids and granddaughter like that. When Brian heard that his sister had passed away, he rushed to her house immediately. He went straight up to Dan. Dan showed no emotion, didn't shed a single tear. I asked him if he'd ever hurt my sister, but he wouldn't look me in the eye. He said no, Brian recalled, the suspicion growing in his heart. Michelle, Kendi's close friend, was also certain that Kendi didn't take her own life. Kendi wasn't depressed. You don't think about getting plastic surgery, work out regularly, and attend spin class if you're planning to end your life. However, Kendi's neighbor, Carrie Maitland, had a different perspective. She remembered the months leading up to Kendi's death, where Kendi had been deeply upset. She was crying her heart out, saying she didn't even deserve to be here. Carrie believed there was no mystery in what happened in the bathroom that night and was convinced Kendi had committed suicide. But for Detective Jerry Northrup, Dan Howard's version of the story didn't add up. There's a logical sequence to events, and it didn't fit. One detail that particularly stood out that night was the running dryer. When first responders entered the house, there were still 6 minutes left on the timer. Northrup decided to investigate further. I went to the manufacturer's website, looked up the specific cycle times, and compared that information to the time when the 911 call was made. The results were startling. The dryer was started within 1 minute of the 911 call being placed. This suggested that Dan wasn't in a panicked, inconsolable state, as he claimed. Instead, he was busy doing laundry while his wife lay dead in the bathtub. These inconsistencies made the detectives increasingly suspicious that a cover-up was at play. Was there any sign of a struggle? We found evidence of a confrontation in the master bedroom, Northrup said. There were shards of broken glass scattered on the floor. Another strange detail was the amount of blood in the bathtub. With a gunshot wound to the head, the water should have been a deep red color from the blood, but it wasn't. Based on my experience, that wasn't normal, Northrup observed. All these factors pointed to one conclusion. This was not a suicide, it was a staged crime scene. Nothing about the case felt right from the start. Detective Sergeant Ken Layton, the lead investigator, said, "So, what really happened that night?" Kendi and Dan's marriage had gone through significant ups and downs. One day, Kendi was determined to divorce, and the next, she hesitated. Finally, she brought home the divorce papers, ready to make a clean break. "We just grew apart, I guess," Dan said. But something in his tone made Detective Ken Layton suspicious. "I got the sense that Dan had a story he had rehearsed to tell us that night. It all felt staged, almost like it had been scripted," Layton shared. One example was when Dan claimed that Kendi had once pointed a gun at her own head during a heated argument. "She held it up to her head, and it freaked me out. I thought, here we go, but then she dropped the gun, and it went off, shooting through the floor." Dan insisted that this was the same gun that had caused Kendi's death. According to Dan, on the night of Kendi's death, they had a big argument about dividing their finances. Kendi went upstairs to take a bath. A short while later, Dan heard a strange noise, something like a thud. But instead of investigating, he waited over an hour before checking, only to find Kendi dead in the bathtub. "I've never heard anyone describe the sound of a gunshot as a thud," Layton said. "Especially not someone like Dan, a former Marine, a police officer with 20 years of experience, a firearms instructor. If anyone could recognize the sound of a gunshot inside a house, it would be Dan Howard." As the morning came, Dan called Kendi's daughter Brooke to break the news. That call didn't go well. Even though Layton couldn't hear Brooke directly, he could sense her shouting at Dan. "What are you talking about? What did you do to my mom?" Brooke's rage changed the entire atmosphere. She accused him of murdering her mother, something I've never seen in any suicide case, Layton said. I could see Dan almost physically shrinking, as if the walls were closing in on him. "Why does your stepdaughter think you killed her mother?" Layton asked, and Dan seemed to have no response. The evidence at the scene increasingly pointed to a cover-up rather than a suicide. In the early morning hours of February 3, 2021, Dan Howard's behavior continued to raise suspicions among the Kootenai County detectives. Brooke's accusations during that phone call pushed the case in a new direction. Was Dan the one responsible for Kendi's death? Brooke was puzzled. "My mom never touched guns. She didn't even take it out of the safe." Things became even more confusing when the autopsy later confirmed that Kendi had died from a gunshot wound. Brooke, lost in her grief and confusion, couldn't understand why Dan hadn't been arrested. "Nothing about this makes sense." Brooke had no idea that just hours after Kendi's death, the investigation had already begun zeroing in on Dan Howard. Kootenai County prosecuting attorney Stan Mortensen was called in to consult with the detectives. They started piecing together the entire timeline of the couple's relationship. So what did they discover about Dan Howard? "We learned that Dan Howard was not the person we thought he was," Mortensen said. "At home, Behind closed doors, he was a completely different man. Investigators focused on a disturbing incident from 2013, when Dan was still a state trooper. Dan had found out that Kendi was having an affair with a neighbor, who also happened to be one of Dan's close friends. In a fit of rage, Dan confronted the man at his office and threatened him. "I'll splatter your brains all over the walls." Dan was accused of repeatedly harassing the neighbor and eventually pleaded guilty to 2 felonies. He served nearly 4 months in jail and was allowed to resign from the Idaho State Police after that. Michelle, Kendi's close friend, said that their relationship seemed to change drastically after the incident. She clung to him like glue, which was so unlike her. She never acted that way before. "I kept thinking, was she afraid?" Michelle recalled. In the years that followed, Dan became more controlling and quick to anger, especially when it came to Kendi's spending. Dan never wanted to go anywhere because it would cost money. "I don't think she ever showed her full personality when he was around," Michelle said. But whenever Dan was about to leave for work in Alaska, Kendi became a completely different person. She realized the more freedom she had, the more she loved life, and she didn't need to live under his control. Their relationship continued to deteriorate. Kendi confided in Michelle about an explosive argument just 7 months before her death. Kendi had hidden credit cards, and Dan found the bills, sparking a huge fight. He grabbed her, held her down, and there were bruises on her neck and arms. "She sent me pictures, and you could see the bruises clear as day in those photos," Michelle shared. But Kendi told Michelle not to tell anyone. Kendi never reported any kind of abuse from Dan to the authorities, even though the signs of control and violence were becoming more evident. Was the physical abuse ongoing for a long time? The police couldn't be sure, but they knew that at least 6 months before Kendi's death, there were clear signs of it. Just 4 days before she died, deputies were called to the Howard home. Kendi's mother had requested a welfare check after receiving a panicked call from her daughter. When the deputies knocked on the door, Kendi answered, visibly nervous. "Can we talk to both of you for a moment?" Kendi, trying to stay calm, replied, "Of course, that's fine." Just hours before, Kendi had picked Dan up from the airport after his long work trip from Alaska. During their conversation, Kendi told him she wanted a divorce, which enraged Dan. Kendi told the officers she needed to grab something from the bedroom. When she walked away, the deputy offered to follow her so they could speak in private, away from Dan. The deputy asked, "Is everything okay? Has he hurt you?" Kendi admitted, "I think I woke up just in time to stop something from happening." She described how Dan wasn't yelling or arguing, which made her even more frightened. "I know what he was going to do," Kendi told the officer. Although the police helped Kendi leave the house that night, they couldn't arrest Dan because she hadn't reported any physical harm. Later, when the investigation continued, prosecuting attorney Julia Schofstall revealed that Kendi had confided in friends about what had happened. She woke up in the middle of the night to find Dan standing over her, dressed in dark clothes, wearing black latex gloves, holding a pillow. The look in his eyes was one she had never seen before, and she truly believed in that moment that he was going to kill her, Kendi told her friends. Although Kendi thought she might be safe after that incident, tragically, she never had the chance to escape. The day before Kendi died, Dan took a long road trip with her brother, Brian. During the trip, Dan began asking about who Kendi was having an affair with. And Brian realized Dan had figured out that Kendi was seeing the real estate agent who was helping her buy a house. The next day, Kendi was dead. For prosecutors, the circumstantial evidence against Dan was piling up. After carefully reviewing Kendi's autopsy, investigators found that she had multiple bruises across her body, lacerations, and a broken jaw. Her body was severely beaten from head to toe, they concluded. They believed that Dan had brutally attacked Kendi before staging the crime scene to cover up the murder. The evidence showed that Kendi hadn't died from the gunshot wound. "We believe she was strangled or choked before being shot," a detective said. Prosecutors suspected that Dan used a restraining technique he learned during his time as a state trooper. Stan Mortensen, who had also been a sheriff's deputy before becoming a prosecuting attorney, explained how the technique could cause death if applied too long. They believe that Dan used this method to kill Kendi before staging the scene to make it look like a suicide. Although there wasn't direct DNA evidence linking Dan to the crime, prosecutors proceeded with the charges. In April 2023, Dan Howard was charged with murder and domestic abuse. He pleaded not guilty and was released on bail, but was required to wear an ankle monitor. In March 2024, Dan Howard stood trial. During the trial, Dan's lawyer refuted the charges, claiming that Kendi had shot herself. After 10 days of trial and more than 8 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Dan Howard was found guilty of second-degree murder. As the court sentenced him, Dan begged for leniency, insisting that he loved his wife and was not the man people made him out to be. However, the judge was unmoved, declaring, "You killed your wife out of pride, greed, and anger." Conclusion. In the end, justice was served. This case serves as a sobering reminder of the devastating effects of domestic abuse and control in relationships. Kendi came so close to escaping, but she never had the chance. Her story is a wake-up call. If you or someone you know is in a similar situation, speak up and seek help before it's too late. Share your thoughts on this case in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more stories like this. Thank you for staying with us till the end.